Welcome back to the London Futurist podcast. Our guest today is James Hughes. James is a bioethicist and sociologist who serves as Associate Provost at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He is also the Executive Director of the IEET, that is the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, which he co-founded back in 2004. Full disclosure, I sit on the board of directors of the IEET. The stated mission of the IEET seems to be more important than ever in the fast-changing times of the mid-2020s. To read a short extract from its website, the IEET promotes ideas about how technological progress can increase freedom, happiness, and human flourishing in democratic societies. We believe that technological progress can be a catalyst for positive human development so long as we ensure that technologies are safe and equitably distributed. We call this a technoprogressive orientation. The extract goes on, focusing on emerging technologies that have the potential to positively transform social conditions and the quality of human lives, especially human enhancement technologies. The IEET seeks to cultivate academic, professional, and popular understanding of their implications, both positive and negative, and to encourage responsible public policies for their safe and equitable use. That mission fits well with what Callum and I like to discuss with our guests on this show. In particular, we'll be asking today about a conference that has just finished in Boston, co-hosted by the IEET, with the headline title, Emerging Technologies and the Future of Work. James, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Delighted to be here. I'm a long-time listener, first-time participant.
Thanks for joining us, James.
James, what would you like to tell our listeners about your personal journey before co-founding and running the IEET?
Well, I'm a scholar partly of retrospective personality reconstruction. If you ask a 60-year-old, what led you to be the person you are today? There's a lot of memory reconstruction that's involved in that question. But the story that I usually tell is that I missed the hippie era. I entered my adolescence in the late 70s when the hippies were mostly already passing the scene. But I had become a Buddhist, I had become a leftist, and I had become a futurist and science fiction fan. So those three things were shaping the way that I was thinking as an adolescent. And in college, I spent most of my time on the question of Buddhist politics, what a Buddhist politics would look like. Went to Sri Lanka, worked for 2 years during their civil war for a Buddhist development organization, tried to figure out if I should be a Buddhist scholar in Japan, ordained as a Buddhist monk for a while. So that was really the question that I was focused on at that time. When I got to graduate school, I was interested in questions that didn't appear to be obvious to the left about bioethics. Bioethics has always fascinated me because it seems like an entirely new terrain of moral questions that has no obvious left-right answer. The status of the fetus and the status of the brain dead and things like that. So I started working on cross-cultural bioethics as a graduate student. And I was also working on the project of eco-socialism because in my political work, I'd gotten very excited about the Greens. So I was trying to figure out what kind of social democratic politics is consistent with an ecological perspective. And there, the question of misanthropy had risen its head as early as the 80s. Basically, are human beings a cancer on the planet? Are we intrinsically hostile to the interests of the planet? So at any rate, around about that point, I met the extropians online because the internet had just gotten started.
Tell our listeners who the extropians were.
So there was this group of folks out in California around Max Moore, Natasha Vita-Moore, and other people that we're still familiar with, who had become basically the first organized transhumanist group. There were some proto-transhumanists before that, but the first organized group of people who thought of themselves as transhumanists around this email list, the extropian email list. And I got on and said, hey, I'm a socialist, and hey, hi. And they tolerated me for about 10 seconds and then kicked my butt off. because we were not politically compatible. But I was very excited by the things they were talking about. So I started to write in my program in Chicago. I wrote my first transhumanist essay about genetic engineering, human genetic engineering, and said, I really think all the arguments against it are nuts. And I'm definitely on the side of embracing genetic engineering. And some of the faculty began to debate with me about me being a Faustian, because I was willing to trade my soul to the devil. So that was 1994, and the World Transhumanist Association gets started in 1998. And when I find out about what Nick and David Pierce had put together and the network of folks...
It's Nick Bostrom and David Pierce.
Yeah, got very excited because for me, this represented the European and more intellectually Catholic approach to this, as opposed to the deeply libertarian Silicon Valley perspective that was coming from the extropians. So I wrote to that effect. I said, look, here's the real social democratic, or at least the version of transhumanism that could incorporate a wider variety of politics. And pretty soon after that, I met Nick at a conference, and I said, look, you guys don't know how to organize your way out of a paper bag. I've been a lefty organizer for my whole life. Why don't I take this over and we can make it a thing? So he said, sure, go for it. And 2001, 2002, we incorporated. I used the Socialist International's constitution to reconstitute the World Transhumanist Association's constitution. We had many debates at the time about whether we were going to be an individual membership organization or a union of parties from around the world. I thought it was a very exciting, frothy time. But one of the things that we immediately confronted was that transhumanism is a very thin ideological commitment. It's basically, if you believe human enhancement technologies are possible, and I think it's hard to argue that they're not going to be possible, and if you look at it the way we do, it's been possible for the last 10,000 years or more, and then you think people have a right to use them. Now, you could have the right to use them under a fascist society or have the right to use them under any kind of societies. We had people within the WTA who were extremely anarchist or extremely supportive of various authoritarian politics around the world. We had a trial for one of our members to determine whether we should expel him for being pro-Stalin. He was a Russian who was saying positive things about Stalin. Can you be a transhumanist and be pro-Stalin? Probably.
What happened in that trial, James? Did you expel him?
I don't think we expelled him because the evidence was overwhelming that the things he had said, a kind of retrospective appreciation for the greatness of Stalin, wasn't an expression of future intent to impose, to have mandatory genetic engineering for everyone in the world or something like that. It was important that we had that discussion because there were also Nazis sniffing around, people who wanted to claim the transhumanist project as a eugenicist project. That had been my concern all along, that we would have this slippage to the right. I've always been a big believer in drawing ideological lines around things. Anyway, the WTA had this problem of ideological definition. It was just such a thin ideological commitment that many, many different kinds of people could sign on. We had constant fights. Some of them were just personality fights. We attracted a lot of people on the spectrum of one sort or another. But eventually, those of us who all agreed that there should be democratic governments and the democratic governments have an obligation to do things for their citizens. That's all you had to agree to. But those of us who agreed, which included Nick Bostrom and a wide variety of politics, but basically left of center, we started the IET. Now, the IET didn't have an explicitly political mission, but it was just like, let's have some place where we can talk about things without having to debate first principles of political economy every single time. And let's have an organization that's not constituted as a membership organization where we actually have to have elections, because it was the annual ritual of elections in the WTA was what was generating all the Sturm und Drang.
So that's all in the past. Can you bring us up to date?
Oh, was that too much history? Sorry, David.
No. History's good. History's good.
To have better foresight, you need to have better hindsight.
True.
There's no point organizations being naive and repeating all the past mistakes again.
That's right.
I'm just wondering, what is the culmination? Have you managed to organize your way out of a paper bag, as you described it?
On the plus side, when the IET was founded in 2005, we had a clear mission. We were basically parasitic with the WTA for the first half a dozen years. holding our conferences at the same time. We had the same board of directors. We saw ourselves as basically the think tank of the WTA. But then we began to drift apart into different directions. And I think it was successful that we took on some projects that the WTA wouldn't or couldn't. One was relatively successful, was the project around popular culture. Some of our most popular writing at the IEET website was our technoprogressive critiques or commentaries on various popular culture series like Battlestar Galactica. We did a conference with science fiction writers and filmmakers out in California about tropes that we saw in science fiction that we thought were problematic. So those kinds of projects were very successful. We were able to support ourselves over time, and we began to collect some philanthropic backing. And then about 5 years ago, we got $1 million from a bequest from an engineer in Ohio. That was dedicated to human enhancement and artificial intelligence research. And that has led us to this new kind of project, which is much more embedded and physical than our virtual projects in the past. So we've been ensconced at University of Massachusetts, Boston, where I've been working and collaborating with the Center for Applied Ethics there. And the first conference that we did as part of this new collaboration was the Future of Work 2-year postdoctoral fellowship, and then the concluding conference that we just held. When we started back in 2005, there were singularitarians around, people who thought artificial intelligence was going to be the end of the world. But we were very critical of those folks for a long time because we thought, look, there's going to be a long transition period. Even if what you think is going to happen is going to happen. I remember once being at a workshop where someone asked a guy from the Singularity University whether he thought technological unemployment was going to be a problem. He said, well, there'll probably be a 10-year gap between the point where all the jobs disappear and where all the magic nano boxes produce everything for people for free. But just 10 years. It'll just be about 10 years or so. It's like, 10 years is a long time. Not to have any income and not to have any food. Those were the kinds of questions, technological unemployment, the transforming nature of work, that we really thought needed more attention. So our current postdoc, Alec, he's a philosopher of work and democracy. Our next project will be about human enhancement, primarily brain-computer interfaces. And then we're thinking about a third project around peace and democracy. Then we've got a collaboration in Italy with our managing director, Steve Umbrello, and we're working on a book series about the politics of human enhancement from that team. And we're doing more theological work with that team. Of the transhumanist organizations, we've been the most tolerant of or friendly with the religious transhumanists, people like the Mormon transhumanists. There's a big interest in transhumanism in American religious scholarship. The American Academy of Religion has a transhumanism section. So I think our next book is going to be about the connections between religion and politics in shaping how we think about human enhancement. The stuff that we used to do about catastrophic risk, it's now just the conversation. Whether artificial intelligence is going to whack us all or how. We've been writing some white papers about that. We did a white paper about the metaverse last year, which I still think is an ongoing thing, even though the hype cycle is completely at its nadir on the metaverse. But I still think we're going to have good augmented reality and things like that. We've written about the effects of LLMs on education, higher education, how it should be incorporated. And we're working now on the automation of counseling and therapy and the impacts of robotics on senior care.
So AI might change everything in due course. We might live in a wonderful environment, but there's a transitional period of at least 10 years perhaps when things are going to be pretty chaotic.
Yeah.
This is what Colin writes about. There might be an economic singularity well ahead of a technological singularity.
One of the things that I have developed as a typical IET rejoinder or response is that I'm not interested in prediction really anymore. I think that futurism has evolved to a point where we're so aware of the chaos element, the butterfly flapping its wings element of future prediction and how off the mark future prediction has usually been, that it's really best to be a scenario thinker, to be thinking in terms of the probabilistic span. For us, the possibility of apocalypse is always there, and the possibility of really much better utopian outcomes is always there. And the question is, what can we do today, given the huge uncertainty, to maximize that we go in the right direction? The argument I've always made is that all of the issues of the future are implicit in the issues of today. If you're concerned about people having the right to control their own genomes and their own bodies in the future, then you should be arguing for a liberalization of, for instance, transgender therapy. People should be allowed to decide what to do with their own bodies today. If they can decide what to do with their bodies today, they'll probably be free to do it tomorrow. Around the brain, the liberalization of drugs, of psychoactive drugs, sets the context for us using cognitive enhancement in the future. I think that there's this connection between our current policy dimensions and what kinds of policies we should have. And that's what I really want to work with you more on in the future, David, because your work on the technoprogressive agenda has been so fruitful.
One thing that struck me about the conference the last couple of days was a talk by Darrell West from the Brookings Institute, who said, yeah, there are tough questions about the new social contract ahead. In principle, he thought, we should be able to figure them out. It's not beyond the wit of humanity to figure out better social contract conditions. However, bad politics, he said, is what gets in the way. We're not able to have grown-up discussions. We are pushed and pulled by extreme views. Is that an analysis you share, James?
I do. I definitely think that our democratic institutions are set for a real revision. One of my more utopian things that I talk about usually in this context is the fact that the cognitive demands of democracy are so high that different forms of cognitive enhancement in the future, such as a brain-computer interface, could have dedicated functions that would make us better citizens, monitoring different kinds of legislation or whatnot. Besides the truly utopian stuff, that may be 50 years away, who knows? Ranked choice voting, other kinds of substantive reforms, electronic referenda, various kinds of e-governance. I'm very interested in the use of an electronic platform to facilitate and automate Robert's Rules of Order, which I've always found to be one of the huge barriers. If you try to actually get involved in politics that uses Robert's Rules, it's labyrinthine. Having something that would advise you, walk you through the steps of how to participate in a democratic process, I think would be a huge benefit.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
The People in Performance podcast offers insights into the strategic competencies, behaviors, and results needed to increase the performance of employees and leaders. The show looks at all areas of the world of work, including attraction and recruitment, onboarding, training, and succession planning. Tune in to get a better handle on the stages of workforce planning you need to master in order to guarantee long-term success in a rapidly changing world of work. New episodes drop each week. Check out the latest People in Performance episodes on your podcast platform of choice. Follow us on socials and read the latest articles at pppod.com.
I'm very skeptical that you can arrange the democratic structure to make sure that you don't get charlatans in charge and you don't get really stupid policies. I think politics goes in cycles. You have periods when the most senior politicians are broadly decent people trying to do a good job, and then you get periods where they're scoundrels. And we're going through one at the moment where they're scoundrels. And I think there's a specific reason why that happens. It goes back very nicely to Alvin Toffler, in a sense, the great founding futurist whose book Future Shock was incredibly influential. People don't like change, and we've had a lot of change. In the last few decades, women have progressed towards some sort of equality. There's still a long way to go, but they've made a huge amount of progress. Racial inequality has narrowed. Sexual inequality, or what you want to do with your gender and whether you want to be gay or not, or whether you are gay or not, there's a great deal of progress in all those areas. And a lot of people are really uncomfortable with that. When President Obama got elected, a twig snapped, and you had the Tea Party founded, and there's a massive backlash against all this progress. It's backlash against change. Then you had globalization, another huge amount of change, which again was in many ways very positive, but people fought back against it or reacted against it. And I think that's why we've got populism, that reaction against change. There's a lot more to populism, but that's essentially what drives it.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have to get past that populism. I don't think we can get past it by doing all the very sensible things that we could do to the democratic structures. In America, for instance, you really ought to get rid of the Electoral College. You ought to have mandatory voting. There's various other things that you should have. But that wouldn't mean people didn't vote for Trump. They still might. We have to get past this fear of change.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a slight hope that the current cycle of populism is going to provide a sort of inoculation against the fear of change, because people will wake up and realize that Trump was an abhorrence and Boris Johnson is an abhorrence, and they will move back to wanting politicians who are clearly decent, honorable people. And I think it's important we do have that inoculation, because the change that's coming in the future is way, way bigger than the change that's caused this current wave of populism.
Mm-hmm.
If and when we get to the point where machines are able to do everything that we can do for money, cheaper, better, and faster than us, which I think they are going to at some point, I don't know whether it's 10, 20, or 30 years ahead, then the change that that will bring will be enormous and much bigger than any change we've had in any comparable period of time. So we need to be inoculated against populism to go through that process successfully. Before we go on to the future jobs, which I'm sure we want to talk about, I loved your history of transhumanism. I think that was fascinating. My perception is that now, in fact, for the last few years, most transhumanists are left-wing, although there are quite a few who are right-wing. I think Max Moore is very much a libertarian on the right, but I think most transhumanists are sort of left-leaning. I find myself slightly to the right, I think, most transhumanists. I think I'm dead centre, but then I suppose we all do. I think capitalism is, broadly speaking, a good system, and I think a lot of people in the transhumanist movement think it's, broadly speaking, a bad thing. What's your perception of the political leaning of transhumanism? Do you think it leans left or smeared equally across the political spectrum?
Well, you're asking the right person, because I'm the person who's been the most interested in surveying transhumanists about their politics. I did a number of surveys of the World Transhumanist Association, and one of the things I was very interested in was that what we saw was that we had members in more than 100 countries, and all told, we had about 5,000, 6,000 people respond to these surveys. At the time, and this was the mid-2000s, it was about a quarter libertarians, or people who associated with various minarchist views. Only about 2 or 3% associated themselves with far-right views, or the term conservative even. So in terms of the far-right infiltration or overlap, it was very, very minor. The libertarian was significant. And then it was about 40% various versions of left around the world. American liberals. In terms of Europe, it would be Labor, Social Democrats, people who were further left, Marxist-Leninists. Euro-liberals would fit in the softest version of anarchism or libertarian capitalism. Then you had the people who believed in various offshoots like technocracy, the view that we should just replace politics with distributive software of some kind, I guess is their view. So I think you're right, certainly in terms of cultural views. Culturally, there are very few opponents of sexual freedom or reproductive freedom within the transhumanist milieu. Now, the question is it intrinsically incompatible in some way such that we could expect that always to be the case? This has always been one of my interests. Is it possible to be a transhumanist fascist? Because there are people who are, but they may not be intellectually consistent, and there may be no basis there for real politics.
I'm not sure about that. Actually, we ought to define what transhumanism is for our audience. It's the belief that we can use technology to improve our cognitive and physical condition, and that we should do that. We should be free to do that.
Right.
And actually, I don't see why that's incompatible with fascism at all. I would have thought Hitler would have been delighted to create a super race of cognitively improved people from his point of view.
And this is one of the arguments for why transhumanism may not be the right term to promote. If it's like consequentialism, there are no evangelists for consequentialism, because you can use the logic of consequentialism to argue for just about anything. In a similar way, I think that because of this flexibility, transhumanism is so thin that we should be much more specific about what kinds of values we're promoting, that we believe, for instance, that everyone should have access to these technologies, not just some elite. That's what I've always been arguing, that transhumanists have to acknowledge that one of the biggest objections, and this was true in the 2000s, but it's even more true now, after Peter Thiel, after Sam Bankman-Fried, Elon Musk, the association of these futurist ideas with elite, quasi-racist and quasi-eugenic projects is much, much stronger now than it was in the 2000s. And so if you believe that we should pull these things apart and make clear that these future possibilities are not intrinsically reactionary, I think you need to say that.
So what term would you prefer instead of we are transhuman?
Well, technoprogressive. In the 2000s, in my first book, Citizen Cyborg, I argued for democratic transhumanism, but that was just too clunky to get very far. The advantage of technoprogressive is that it has the term progress in it, which has both this technological association and the political association of progressive. At least in the United States, more people respond positively to progressive than to liberal.
And you're using progressive in the sense of economic distribution, so a tendency towards equality.
Its vagueness is part of its appeal. I believe that there are two principal dimensions of politics: the cultural kind of cosmopolitanism versus traditionalism dimension, and the economic. And I would say that the techno-progressives are progressives in both of those senses. Now, when I say that, am I just saying I wish that there were people like that out there? No, there actually are people out there. They don't think of themselves as techno-progressives, and they may not think of themselves as allies. So part of this is like, is there a political project where we could point to the people in disability rights who are saying, hey, we should all have access to the latest assistive and curative technologies, which I consider the techno-progressive point of view. And people in feminism who say, look, feminists should take on board genomic choice as one of their reproductive rights. I know that those two groups of people do not think of themselves as part of a common project. I think that they should. That's part of what the IET's project is, to point to those people and say, look, you're arguing the same things for similar reasons. You should be part of the same political movement.
What's your view on redistributing income via universal basic income? Is that something that should be a high priority?
I have been pro-basic income since I was a teenager, not only because I think it's going to be the only plausible, equitable approach to redistribution in a future with radically diminished employment opportunities. So I think technological unemployment would contribute to the argument for universal basic income. When Romney ran for president, it was 2012, he argued that almost half of Americans were receiving federal benefits, and that the givers versus the takers was the basic political dynamic. Now, as the population ages, the majority of us are going to be takers, right? And then the question is the equitableness of our social welfare scheme. I think one of the huge problems we face, especially as transhumanists, because we envision technologies coming relatively quickly, which are going to radically extend people's life expectancies. And at the same time, we see that the global fertility rate is crashing. So the number of younger people who are going to be around to take care of older people is radically diminishing. And we see the consequences, the fiscal and geopolitical consequences of that in China and other places. And so for me, one of the overriding facts is that our current system of social welfare, which is based on disability, which is fine, and age is not fine, because we're going to soon have this huge lopsided population. So universal basic income just seems like the obvious solution to equity within that kind of a scheme. Now, to have the kind of basic income that would actually fulfill basic needs, any level of basic income is good for people. That's what the experiments have shown. And any level of basic income will be sticky as a social policy because everyone will want to keep getting those checks. And that's what we social democrats want. We want sticky social policies that can't be taken away by the next neoliberal banker who gets into the PM's office. So we want a UBI for that reason. And then as it expands, it would necessarily require the redistribution of wealth because, for instance, in the United States, if we were to redistribute every transfer payment that's given in the United States right now and make it equal between all citizens, it would be about $4,000 a person per year. It wouldn't be enough to support life. So if we have strong, robust economic growth from technological innovation, and we have widespread occupational churn as a consequence of that, then I think we're going to see a strong argument for UBI and an increasingly generous one. Does that answer your question, David?
Indeed.
I'd like to add something to that, actually.
Sure.
Because I think universal basic income is one of the things that generates most confusion in the whole futurist area, whole futurist debate. It seems pretty obvious that if we get to a point where machines can do everything that we can do for money, cheaper, better, and faster than us, there aren't going to be jobs for humans. And if we're smart and a bit lucky, that should be a great world, because a world in which machines do all the jobs is a world in which humans do whatever we want to do. And we can have a new renaissance and we can all have a lot of fun. But obviously, there needs to be distribution of resources from whoever's got them to the rest of us, most of us, who haven't got them. And that's inevitable and obvious. But the word universal basic income, or the phrase, is terrible because we need much better than a basic income. And Elon Musk, who's gone down some terrible rabbit holes lately, made the very sensible point that basic income isn't good enough. We need a high income. But between now and then, when there are still jobs, and actually I think right up until the point where machines can do almost everything, there's going to be tons of jobs for humans because automation creates wealth and creates demand, creates new jobs, then UBI doesn't work. And as John Kay, the economist, said, if it's high enough to be useful, it's not affordable. Even if it's affordable, it's not high enough to be useful. As you said, James, give people a little bit of money, that makes them a bit better off, but it doesn't liberate them from the need to go out and get a job and have a miserable time doing it. And you can't redistribute enough from the rich people to give everybody a decent amount of income unless you have some sort of abundance, which is generated by machines doing everything. So between now and the economic singularity, UBI doesn't work. And after the singularity, it's not enough. So it seems to me to be a very confused concept.
Well, I love the way that you're framing it, because the way I would tell that story is that we're going to start with a little bit that we can afford, and then people will push for more, and some of that will require the redistribution of wealth and income from increasingly redistributive taxes. But eventually, if the working population is shrinking and your principal fiscal dependency of your state is on taxation of working people, yeah, there's a disconnect there. And that point of disconnect, I would say the next stage after that is actually to think about new economic arrangements, because we still will be a wealthy society. It's just a question of the wealth's over there and we don't know how to get to it with the taxation. I think that's the point at which we reconsider public ownership. For instance, there's been proposals for nationalizing or creating public ownership of various big tech firms. I don't think that we're ready for that proposal now, and I don't think it would be politically positive to have any one body control those agencies. But I do think that, for instance, with natural resources, it seems obvious. With the climate crisis and the control of carbon that we want to have in the future, it doesn't make sense to have private ownership of carbon extraction resources these days. Turning those into public resources, as is the case in Alaska, for instance, where all oil is owned by the citizens of Alaska. So every year, every Alaskan gets a $4,000 check as the dividends from their ownership of those resources. I think we're going to have to go towards more public ownership of resource model in order to finance a UBI.
Oh, that's you letting off your left-wing instincts, letting them off the leash.
Well, it's only left wing if it hasn't happened yet, I suppose. We have these kinds of things already. Public resources. 60% of Norway's GDP is publicly owned, and they're one of the wealthiest and freest societies in the world.
They happen to be sitting on a lake of gas. It was just kind of helpful. And there's not very many of them.
Well, yeah, and compared to most resource-rich countries, they did very well. But it shows that there isn't an inevitable resource trap if you have a lake of oil.
Can I ask about any other themes that caught your attention from the conference that's just finished?
I think one of the most exciting talks was by Juliet Schor, who's been one of the leading scholars of work time in the United States. I hope everyone's aware that Americans work ourselves to death. Not as bad as the Japanese and the Chinese. The Japanese and the Chinese actually do worse, but we have a distinctive work culture in the United States that's not entirely positive. So Juliet Schor has been documenting that, and she has been working on an international campaign for a 4-day work week, a 32-hour work week. And she told a fascinating story about the fact that when this was first being legislated in the 1930s here in the United States, that there was consideration of a 30-hour work week, a 6-hour work day, 5 days a week. There are many experiments going on in many different kinds of industries, and she is involved in monitoring these, and the experiments are almost uniformly positive in terms of their effects on productivity. I think it's a mixed story. I'm actually facing this right now as a boss at my university because I have a staff shortage. A bunch of folks discovered the Great Resignation. I'm down to just me and my software doing what 6 people used to do. And the fact that I'm able to do that is bittersweet because it means that we all weren't working very hard if I'm able to do all the work.
Or is it partly due to you using GPT-4?
One of the many tools I'm using. Basically, automation has made it possible to have significant efficiencies at work. That's part of this 4-day work week story. You're basically telling people, look, I know that you're not working all the time. So if you just actually worked for 4 days, you'd be able to get the same amount done. And it turns out to be the case.
An interesting thought about the amount of time people spend at work. Over the last couple of centuries, we have drastically reduced the amount of time that most people work. Weekends was a relatively recent invention.
Right.
And yet, well-off middle-class people work harder than they ever did. So it's not uncommon if you work for Goldman Sachs or McKinsey or top law firm, you work 70, 80 hours a week. And I wonder whether the move to a 4-day working week will actually create more inequality than we have, because people doing not super well-paid jobs will work 4 days a week, will get paid around about the same. But then the elite, that's the wrong word, but the elite will carry on working 70 or 80 hours a week because they want to and because they get massive rewards from it. And their rewards will separate them even further from the average.
Well, in the first place, by definition, these 4-day work week experiments are on what she called a 100-80-100 model. They have to demonstrate that you can get 100% of the productivity and that the workers are going to maintain 100% of the pay that they had in the original setup. So there's no diminution of pay.
And the 80 in the middle is through 80% of the number of hours that they used to clock up.
Through 80% of the hours, yeah. So there's no diminution of pay necessarily in this experiment. But I think it's interesting that your mind goes there, Caleb, because basically you're comparing a hedge fund manager who makes $2 million a year in income and saying, oh, well, he's going to keep working those 80 hours and making those $2 million, but this schlub over here who's only making $70,000 a year, he's just going to be stuck there because he agreed to a 4-day work. I don't think that's the right way to think about inequality, Caleb. There's other ways to think about inequality.
I don't think the person working 4 days a week is the schlub. I think that they are going to be the majority.
Yeah.
I don't think that the people working 70 or 80 hours a week are only hedge fund managers making 2 million, but the people who are making 150 plus. And I just wonder whether there will be an effect of creating a bigger income gap. There's already a big wealth gap between those two groups. And contrary to public belief, apart from in America, the income gap between upper middle class people and lower middle class and working people in Europe hasn't actually changed that much over the last 20, 30 years. But the wealth gap has increased. But if you have this new world of 4 days a week and super well-paid people from 150 grand upwards still working 78 hours, I just wonder whether there'll be a bigger inequality gap. I don't know. It's just a possibility.
We should probably invite Juliet Shaw on to have that discussion with her.
Yeah, maybe we should.
She had fascinating data about improvements in work life, all aspects of health and satisfaction and other issues. It was impressive. As far as I understand, it hasn't yet been properly published yet, so we can maybe hear from her.
Yeah, I've always advocated for the shorter work week, but I'm also interested in the shorter work day, work year, and work life. I think that extending formal education should be part of our policy agenda. I think we need to seriously debate retirement. It's such a political non-starter to raise the retirement age in any country right now. If that's just a political given, then we have to work around that. But if we could raise the retirement age or have an extended period of retirement where people were encouraged to do white-collar things, I don't know, something. I haven't figured out the retirement aspect of it, but reducing working as a matter of policy is definitely on the agenda.
Or reducing the amount of time people spend in jobs, in paid work, which they don't direct themselves. I think humans will always work as long as we're humans. It's kind of part of our nature.
Right.
But we will increasingly not do it for money.
But whether inequality is going to increase, I think is, of course, in everyone's mind. Whether the current trends in the economy are going to continue to differentially benefit rich people. Part of the debate about the future of work has been about what's called skill bias change. The argument that David Autor and others have made that one of the reasons for the growing inequality in industrialized societies is that jobs that do repetitive cognitive or physical tasks are the most amenable to automation. Those jobs tend to be in the middle of the income spectrum. The jobs at the bottom tend to be manual jobs. Like digging a ditch isn't something that it's cost effective to have a robot for. And at the top, creative and highly educated labor has been more immune to this. One of the big questions right now is that the LLMs and the expectation around where LLMs show we're going means that the automation of cognitive labor and tasks like creativity and social emotional labor, the fact that you can have affective robots who are more socially emotionally intelligent than a human being, you can have access to DALL-E and things like that. Are they creative? I don't know whether they're creative or not, but they certainly do the things that people were hiring creatives to do. Those have shown that cognitive labor, college-educated labor, is not going to be as immune from automation as people thought. And that's changing not only our expectations about inequality and the labor market, but also about the politics of this. One of the explanations for the rise of proto-fascist populism around the world is that blue-collar populations in the industrialized world who were in the past historically supportive of social democratic politics have shifted from that increasingly towards far-right politics, populist politics, blaming immigrants and whatever. They're not blaming, for the most part, automation, but there's empirical evidence that the populations most impacted by automation have been most likely to make this shift. Support for Brexit, support for Trump, support for fascism in Europe. So one of the things that may change is that if automation doesn't contribute as much to our polarization between our college-educated and non-college-educated populations and the cosmopolitan versus anti-cosmopolitan politics that has generated.
These are big questions and we could go on for a long time, but maybe I can just ask you one final question, James, about the future for yourself. It's nearly 20 years since your magnificent book, Citizen Cyborg, came out. What are you looking to do in the future?
Well, if I have any advice to writers is don't take big projects. The biggest intellectual project, the most exciting intellectual project. Because after I finished Citizen Cyborg, my agent and I decided I should work on this book about moral enhancement, Cyborg Buddha, which it's been hard to commit to because it's been a huge torrent, a river, an avalanche of moral neuroscience research that I've been trying to keep on top of. My writing projects, a book on technoprogressive public policy has been in the works, and a book about religion. I'm very interested in the questions of whether there's a kind of God-shaped hole in human consciousness that we need to fill with something, and whether it can be filled by the kind of naturalistic spirituality that is promised by futurism. So a variety of intellectual projects that I'm interested in. My time as university administrator will soon be concluded, but I think the collaboration that we have with UMass Boston will be fruitful and continue as an intellectual project. I'm getting a lot of interest in the Buddhist side of things these days. I'm talking to a bunch of Buddhists in Italy in 2 weeks about the future of consciousness and brain-computer interfaces. Maybe I'll rebrand myself as a self-help guru and tell people which ADHD drugs to take.
Oh, you'll make a lot more money doing that, James.
No. Being a left-wing transhumanist public intellectual has not been that lucrative. No, not really.
There's no money in that. But self-help, yeah, that's a rich field.
Well, thanks very much for your time. You've left lots of big questions on the table. Your projects ahead, each of them seem pretty huge to me, so I wish you lots of success with them and lots of speed, and maybe with the help of GPT-4 and with various other psychedelic enhancements, you'll be able to finish them sooner rather than later.
Your mouth to God's ears, David.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.